All right, let's pick up with the Enlightenment in Europe, where it's moving from, and something's covering up what we need to see there. There we go. So you see that there's kind of a lot of monkey see, monkey do in life. As you see, one of the things on this map, palaces molded after are modeled after Versailles. King Louis XIV builds the palace to end all palaces, but other rulers start building some like it throughout Italy, a little bit to some degree in England, throughout the Germanic states. Once one country kind of establishes a royal scientific society, other countries, other city-states of the former Holy Roman Empire of Italy, which is not necessarily a country yet, but is more its own city-states as well, start forming these things as well. Remember, Peter the Great is also all about, and I want to say this is actually past his rule, but they're also establishing those things there as well. There's a lot of monkey see, monkey do, and it's kind of like that in the world today, in regards to many things. To some degree, whoever the lead nation is, whatever they do is what everybody else is going to do until someone surpasses and masters that model. And then there's going to be a lot of monkey see, monkey do to what they're doing. It's like that in sports. It's like that in a lot of things. We talked about Voltaire a lot, and I won't go much into him. But he definitely had criticism towards the church, towards intoleration of others based on religious beliefs. Voltaire, I want to say he starts out as French, but that's his pen name. I want to say he ends up living in Germany, or modern day Germany. What was then we're starting to organize into an area called Prussia. And he definitely puts in some, and is in correspondence with a lot of leaders that we'll talk about later. And really part of what he can be attributed with is deism. He does challenge the church and its interpretation of the Bible based on what he sees in the world around him. But he does not challenge the idea that there is a God. And remember, this idea of deism is the idea that there is a God is a watchmaker. Is probably the best analogy I know of it. Which is the idea that like a watchmaker builds a watch, sets everything up, sets it into motion. Occasionally may have to do a little maintenance, but for the most part, that watch just does what it does, and the watchmaker never has to actually actively play a role in the life of a watch. And that was God. They said that the world was a complex thing that had to have been created by a God. However, they don't accept that God has an active role in the lives of human beings. There is actually a thing Jefferson had one time called a deist Bible, and they went through the Bible and said anything that sounded irrational or impossible to happen. They said one of two things: either God's not around playing a role in the world anymore, or they said those things never happened and were made up. And so a deist Bible is basically a creation story and some parables about life and such, Psalms and Proverbs, and that's basically it. There's Voltaire, handsome and striking man as always. So we need to talk about Denis Diderot, who publishes the first known encyclopedia, who wanted to compile all human knowledge. And think about it, this is a really, really cool thing, actually. And I guess its modern disciple is kind of Wikipedia. I guess there's the Encyclopedia Britannica that has its whole thing. But there ends up being, for a long time, for generations, if you go ask your grandparents about an encyclopedia salesman, I mean, that was a big thing. People used to actually go door to door selling the encyclopedia, all the knowledge of the world, in a series of books. And maybe in your house, if you dig around, you can even find an old set of encyclopedias. So Diderot kind of combined all of the science and philosophy that everyone had came up with. He actually put it all together. Now, what ends up happening when we get to enlightened monarchs is he wants to publish it in France. I think he ends up wanting to publish it in Prussia. I want to say it ends up getting published by Catherine the Great in Russia, actually, in Russian, as a little bit of a flex move on Europe, actually. And remember, it is built on the backs of the printing press as well. It is now able to be made cheaper. There's higher literacy rates, and so it helps to spread a lot of these ideas around. Remember, mainly among richer people. We're starting to move towards studying of economics as well and applying science to that to some degree. And the real name you really need to understand here is Adam Smith, who ironically enough in 1776, and if I want to go, what's the guy's name in Parks and Recreation, who said history started in 1776, everything prior to that moment was a mistake. Adam Smith establishes what kind of becomes the key works of what is now capitalism. And Adam Smith establishes a book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he said the richest nations in the world were those that had little little regulation of their economies, that more or less left um, people to do as they pleased. And in America today, what we accept as the three bases of what government is supposed to do in our lives is actually based on something in the Wealth of Nations, where he said that they have to protect their people. I mean, you got to have a nation, you got to have borders, you got to have soldiers, you got to protect us. You have to have a court system, injustice, oppression. You have to have a system of laws. You got to keep order among the people in your country, as well as we just mentioned, protect them from other people. And you had to have public works. Now, he also mentioned there had to be things like taxation. He understood building. Remember, we're kind of building up on the shoulders of the people who came before us. He took to some degree what John Locke had said and said that we have to have people give up money, taxes. He actually said the richer people should pay more of those taxes, a progressive tax rate, if you will, um, to keep up to some degree a public system here. That would work. But he also said that there should be little regulation on what people buy, sell, trade. And when you get to civics and economics, I studied economics part, you'll study a little bit about what makes up capitalism. Um, and I would argue that this system of capitalism, for its faults, it is the worst economic formation except for all the others. Because capitalism has actually led to more people gaining wealth and has led to, I mean, it does, there is inequality. There's the poor, there's the rich. I get it. But at the same time, we're not all poor. And the growth that, that people have been able to have under the aspects of capitalism has been better than any other economic system that has ever been organized. So now we're starting to get towards late Enlightenment ideas. By the time we get towards basically around the time America starts, that's kind of like the end of the Enlightenment. Or is it ever end? Interesting. So there's the stages of history, the why is reason necessary, but we're kind of running out of ideas. We're going to have to get to industry and our scientific revolution to kind of build up on this. So we talked about the social contract for Rousseau, and Rousseau was actually one of the first people to really coin and work around the idea of a social contract. But the idea of how it comes in America is more or less how it follows John Locke and his ideal. And remember and even though Rousseau had a lot of bad things to say about women, arguably he kind of got burned a lot in terms of promiscuous activities and such. So, if you're ever looking at context of why did he have the views he did on women, it might have been due to his poor personal experience. But he did advocate for the rights of men. And really, if we're looking at progression of morality, to go from a time period where people live with kings and nobles, dukes, duchesses, lords, and those sort of things, to go from that to equality of all men, all women, all race would have been a very major step. It would have been a good major step, but the reality of history is we're moving the ball down the field. And earlier I talked about at that point we're going for the equality of all white men in Europe. And later on it became about race, it became about women, it became about LGBT. Each generation kind of moves that ball further down the field. Rousseau is moving the ball down the field, but he's not moving the ball down the field. He's not going for the 99-yard rush or whatever to say, all right, equality for everybody, men, women, all that, right? He's not moving the ball. It's not a 99-yard rush to the end zone here, but it is, let's get the ball 10 yards down. Let's move it 10 more yards, 10 more yards, 10 more yards. I'll post this video for you later, but it's Barack Obama talking about a lot of these ideas. There's Rousseau for you, another handsome young lad. So let's talk about women. Remember, there's a couple of steps forward and steps back. Now, Diderot and Voltaire did start to see that, they're not necessarily seeing women as full equals, but they do see that women have a better role than others, or what we had seen in the past, actually. But they do generally agree that women are physically weaker, which that bit of science does not help women at all figure out much of history. The fact that they are physically weaker due to hormones is not something that is studied for a long time. It is thought that, well, they are just physically inferior and they are meant to bear children, and that's it. We do see a few women, however, starting to advocate for equality among at least education and marriage. That, hey, we may not be physically strong enough to hold our weight in a fight against a man, but we have brains and we can think and we can talk and we can reason, and we should be allowed to do that. And we should have an equal footing in marriage. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft, her daughter, goes on to write Frankenstein, but she could be seen as like a mother of modern feminism and does write for the rights of women. And this is towards the end of a period we would call the Enlightenments. And arguably, a lot of these rights will not start coming up until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we will see a role of women here momentarily. Now, where these things spread, remember, it's mainly upper classes. Remember, this is a rich person's thing, so to speak. But what we define as rich is beginning to work its way down. Without getting on too much of a sidetrack here, the way we all live, and even the lower classes of America today, is to live like a king lived a couple hundred years ago. That sort of education, that sort of thought is working its way down, and now we're kind of having an upper middle class that we can kind of say, well, there's some of those rich people who get some of these Enlightenment ideas. And we start having what they didn't call a salon. I guess nowadays you'd say it's kind of like when people want to meet at a Starbucks and have some coffee and a drink and a snack and discuss or study or whatnot. You would actually have these salons where people would kind of get together and discuss the bright ideas of the day. And we can act out one of these on a discussion board, or if we were in class, we could do it in class even one day. And so it kind of becomes like the role of women to cook the treats and have the tea and actually have places where people will gather and discuss these ideas. And so here's a picture of one all facing the same way, ironically enough. Pretty famous painting there. So how they were portrayed. Remember, now you're starting to see the woman dressing up. You see the woman adds a little flower. She's making herself feminine. Some makeup. How they dress, the way they wear their hair. You're starting to see somewhat of the modern role that to be feminine was starting to adopt some of those roles that men used to have in terms of wearing makeup and such. I'm not going to spend too much time on the music and the arts. Sometimes a question or two does show up in multiple choice on this. So there's a couple of different things that you would want to take a look at, but just for the sake of time, I'm not going to really talk about it much, honestly. Most of this, since this has been published, has kind of worked its way into AP Art class, although sometimes a question on it does still show up on an AP Euro exam. What we do need to talk about, though, is the novels. Now, there has to be a chain of events that leads to a novel being written. Remember, the number one book in all human history has been the Bible. But once you have literacy, and once you have education working its way down to where the definition of rich people who can read and educate is starting to work its way down to more and more people, those more and more people start wanting things to read. And in American history, you start seeing the dime novels coming along about the Old West. At this point, though, you're starting to see the emergence of modern novels and fiction. Going back to Mary Wollstonecraft, her daughter Mary Shelley, and Frankenstein, you're starting to see books. People want things to read. They don't have smartphones to entertain themselves, remember. People start writing and studying history. Voltaire had a very critical look on Louis XIV. They start to write about history and trying to learn the lessons of history. And as we now, as historians, study, we try to look at the lessons history can teach us and how can we apply those to modern day. And ultimately learn that those who study history are going to make less money than those who study other crafts, unfortunately for us. And those of us who study history and know its mistakes are doomed to watch others repeat the mistakes of history. So some pretty pictures, some castles, what the things looked like at the time. You can pause and take a look at them or go through this PowerPoint elsewhere and take a look at these things. Kind of looks like a good format for a meme template. So high culture. Remember, there's actually going to start being newspapers, some of which were actually printed on rubber so you could read them in the bathtub. So in addition to novels, in addition to the printing press being really perfected, people want to study and know what's going on. So the advent of newspapers, more and more people going to university and studying and working their way up to higher classes and such are going to become a thing. Um, so, but remember, it is overall the ability to go to college has been a thing of the upper middle class and the rich for most of human history. So here's a picture of the coffee house, wearing your wigs. And the wigs do kind of carry over out of the Enlightenment for men for the most part, mainly to cover hair loss, but it also made you look important. Um, Studies on crime and punishments. At this time, the idea that criminals, there starts coming this idea that a criminal could be someone born with those sort of desires anyway. Um, so that certainly is something that leads into the 19th century. But the emergence of the modern prison system, rather than just kill off any deviants and such, the theory of what is the role of crime and punishment, um, and moving towards trying to correct the wrongs of those who commit crimes and possibly just isolate those people who cannot seem to learn their lesson away from society, and that punishment of having to live the rest of your life in a prison cell could deter anyone from having to commit crimes anyway. So in the world of medicine, we do start to see the modern hospital come along, the modern form of medicine. Some of your first surgeons actually were barbers. Think about it. You needed somebody who had tools to cut things. They could cut hair. They could possibly also cut an arm off. They'd have the tool. Um, so it does eventually work its way to people who are more skillful and educated in the sort of thing than just what may be necessary to cut hair. And this actually starts to while we may see midwives and faith healers, we are starting to move away from that eventually. And important thing for education was the education to be a doctor rather than just, say, a faith healer or even a midwife. And this actually is kind of a step back for women. Traditionally, the joy of childbirth, the labor of childbirth was something associated where older women who could no longer give birth would kind of pass on the trade to the younger ones who are now getting pregnant and teach them what to expect when they're pregnant and be with them as they're pregnant. And it was somebody who had that experience of having done that event for herself. Now, it's kind of a step back for women because now a man who has gone to education and studied childbirth is going to tell a woman, keep in mind he's never had a kid, but he's going to tell her how to have a kid, for better, worse, or indifferent. And here I'm going to leave off, but there's something I need to discuss about this. And there's nothing written here on it, but people for the first time in history are now able to have leisure time. Ultimately, technology is starting to improve. People are starting to build better homes. People are living longer. Childhood mortality is dropping. And life, while overall sucky, is not as bad as it was a couple of hundred years ago. So, common people are now doing more things like learning how to read. They're reading the newspaper. Common people are doing more thinking. They are also looking for ways to keep themselves entertained. And this is something in the 21st century. There is no shortage of entertainment. I mean, entertainment is no more than a telephone away. At that time, the carnival was a big deal. And it could be a thing that when the carnival came around, you could just let loose and have fun for a couple of weeks. Fighting, promiscuity, all those kind of things could be something. The role of drinking, the advent of, I guess, would be a modern bar. At one time, drinking, richer people drank fine whiskeys and wines. Poor people drank beer. Rich people drank to enjoy themselves. Poor people drink to drown their sorrows. Poor people go to a bar with other poor people, other poor grunts, and they complain about their life and they drink their sorrow away. They complain about their wives, their kids, and whatnot. Rich people go to have a glass of wine to relax and unwind and enjoy the day. So that's what's meant by the drinking habits being different. And to some degree, starting to educate themselves a little bit, though. Starting to see at least an education system to teach people the very basics of reading and writing. Not necessarily, of course, what we see in a public education system in America today, but we're moving in a more positive direction. And hopefully that will give you an idea of how the life for the common person is improving. Although, remember, not quite to where we want it to be. So thanks for watching, but we are moving that ball down the field.